It's a short article, and it appeared October 29th, called Slightly Imperfect Bibles. It says, would you purchase a Bible that was missing an entire page? Not many would, I suppose, but when compared to the Bibles, I just have to stop for a second and point out, it is funny that the TR is based upon Erasmus's work, and the one manuscript he had of Revelation was missing the last page. It's sort of funny. And he had to translate from Latin into Greek and came up with readings that are still in the TR today, and these guys would defend as being representational of the original when there is zero chance, absolutely zero chance, that they are what John actually wrote. But the problem is, as soon as you admit that any kind of revision has to be made to the TR, then you have to present a consistent system that taking the manuscripts will result in the TR. The application of these principles to the manuscripts result in the TR. There is no such system. They know that. They are well aware of that. Jeff Riddle is well aware of the fact that he has to use one set of arguments over here and one set of arguments, and these two sets of arguments can be 180-degree opposite. It can be completely contradictory, but he'll use two different sets of arguments for two different readings because the reading has already been determined by the Textus Receptus. So you use whatever arguments you need to use. So, would you purchase the Bible that's missing an entire page? Not many would, I suppose, but when compared to the Bibles published in Reformation times, most modern versions are actually missing about that much content. 12 verses at the end of Mark's Gospel are missing. An additional 12 verses from John's Gospel are missing. 16 other verses are usually found missing, and several more words and verses have either been deleted or noted as questionable. Many seek to minimize these discrepancies by speaking only in terms of the percentage of material missing. The 40 verses references above constitute less than 1/4% of the whole. However, if you compare the amount of missing material to the length of some books in Scripture, the discrepancy appears as more significant. Now, I just stop for a second. What Reformed theology, what Reformed doctrine is based upon any of the parallel verses in the Gospels, because that's what he's referring to. There are numbers of places where Matthew has a verse and Mark won't, and so there'll be manuscripts that'll put Matthew's verse in where it should be in Mark if Matthew and Mark were supposed to be photocopies of each other, which they're not. In the woman taken in adultery, and especially the longer ending of Mark, which Reformed doctrines, is it predestination that's dependent upon them? How is any Reformed doctrine impacted by any of them? I would say none. Absolutely, positively none. But 40 missing verses contain 854 words. That's more than the prophecy of Obadiah. That's more than the epistle of Jude. That's more than Paul's epistle to Philemon. That's more than the second and third epistles of John combined. Would you buy a Bible that was advertised with this disclaimer, slightly imperfect, missing only one or two epistles? Modern scholars will undoubtedly take some umbrage of such argumentation, as we should if we are consistently reformed and logical with our own principles and presuppositions. But that is only because they believe the missing verses never belonged there in the first place. Or it's because they hold to the position that I want to know what Paul wrote. I want to know what Luke wrote. I want to know what John wrote. That's the issue here. That is absolutely the issue here. Once you embrace TR-onlyism, that is no longer your perspective. You have now said, I know what they wrote, and it was produced in a haphazard manner by Erasmus primarily. And in fact, my entire understanding of the book of Revelation is based upon Erasmus's rushed work from the borrowed Latin commentary from Johannes Reuchlin that was missing the last pages, that Erasmus knew was a mess and had to be fixed, but didn't fix it because he told his printers, go get those guys' New Testament that had done it since he had put his out and fix my book of Revelation in light of what they have, but didn't know that they had based their work on his book of Revelation, so it was never fixed. And so the errors he made in his first edition are in the TR today, but that's what John wrote. That's what John wrote. No Christian had ever seen it until 1516. No Christian had ever possessed the actual text, the book of Revelation, until 1516, according to these guys. Never seen it. But now, we have it, and there's no questioning. Can't apply any analysis to it. All this historical stuff you're talking about, yeah. If you want to know what John wrote Revelation, you can't be a TR-onlyist. Period. I'll debate anybody on that. Anybody, any of you guys want to do that? Dr. Real, you want to do that one? Because that one, that'll never happen. That'll never happen. Because, wow, Revelation 16:5, Revelation 14:1, just so, the last 6 verses, and every single one of those verses, you'd have to use different arguments to substantiate the mistakes that Erasmus made. Not going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, your position's refuted. Stands refuted, and all you can do is hide in your little Facebook groups and talk amongst yourselves. And that is a shame. It is their position that the otherwise pious scribes in ancient times intentionally corrupted the Bible by adding words to it. Okay, let me correct that. It's fallacious and false, but let me correct it. Especially the parallel corruptions were probably not intentional, in the sense that when you have, and you see this, if you would do what I did, I think was it 7 years or 9 years? I'm trying to remember how many years it was that I taught through the Synoptic Gospels. And I used a parallel Greek text to do it. And so you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they all are giving the same pericope. Very frequently that doesn't happen. But when you have parallels, what you see is whenever you have a major difference in wording, inclusion of a short or even longer verse in one that's not found in the other, there were many scribes that attempted to harmonize in the two parallels. And their reasoning could either be the Matthew is supposed to be a photocopy of Mark, which is supposed to be a photocopy of Luke, which is simply not true. Or they thought, because they knew the text from Matthew, that it was supposed to be there and the preceding scribe missed it, and so they weren't intentionally trying to corrupt anything. They were trying to be a conservative, good, pious person, as it says here. Or they were copying by memory and had it memorized and knew it from the other version and just put it in. That's what happens in Colossians 1:14 when it's paralleling Ephesians 1:7. We have redemption through his blood. That was the more commonly used phraseology from the longer section in Ephesians 1, but it's not a part of the Greek manuscripts of Colossians 1 for 900 years. And so we know how it got there. It's the same language as Ephesians, and so someone who knew it from Ephesians probably inadvertently inserted it in. Didn't we know they did? So it's not the case that it is their position that the otherwise pious scribes in ancient times intentionally corrupted the Bible by adding words to it. It's not true. I don't know why you have to put this type of stuff in there, but it is common from this group. This view, however, now listen to this, is out of accord with what the Reformed have confessed for centuries, namely that God not only inspired the Scriptures, but also kept them pure in all ages by his singular providence and care. Westminster Confession of Faith 1:8. It's also in the London Baptist Confession of Faith, and once again, this is an abuse of the confessional statements. The confessional statements did not have available to them, the men who wrote them did not have available to them what we have today. To try to drag them into this dispute, I think is just one of the most unfair things that is done in this situation. They did not have the information we have today. They did not have access to the manuscripts that we have today. And so to say that they were taking a position, this Greek text over against this much more ancient Greek text. In fact, I can guarantee you, let me put this in a real world way. What you're saying is that a portion of the later Byzantine manuscripts, and not even the best portion, not even the ones that go back the farthest, the 12th century version of the Greek manuscripts is what God has preserved over against the Greek manuscripts in the possession of the ancient church when they were arguing the ecumenical creeds. That's what you're saying. That's what you're saying. And if you had told that to the King James translators, if you had told that to the Westminster Divines, they would have laughed at you. They had no interest in dividing themselves off from the early church and the texts that they would have had. When it talks about being kept pure in all ages, they knew there were textual variants. They are primarily responding against the Counter-Reformation and the Jesuits. And what did Rome put forward as the great standard initially in response to the Reformation? The Latin Vulgate. And it was Rome that attacked the Greek manuscripts. And so they defended simply what they had against the Counter-Reformation. To ignore that context and then say, oh, they'd be with us, I think is just absolutely abusive of church history. It really is. These are two very different views of the transmission of Holy Scripture. One assumes early corruption, and the other presupposes providential preservation. That is not true. You cannot for a second dispute the fact that beginning with Justin, going through Origen, anybody who knows church history knows that there has been a discussion of these variants, and the manuscripts bear it out. This is the historical reality that we have to deal with. And so the issue is not whether God preserved the text of Scripture, but how. And Rome said they did it through the Vulgate. You say they did it through the Textus Receptus. And we say they did it so that every generation of the church had access to God's truth. See the difference? Rome had given up on saying we need to know what Paul wrote. We know what Paul wrote because God gave us the Vulgate and God's used it in his church for 1,100 years. That's it. And now we have people saying, we know what Paul wrote because God gave us Textus Receptus and it was used by the Westminster Divines and it was used by John Owen and therefore we know. They're both utterly invalid arguments and must be rejected. Must be rejected if we are going to do any kind of defense of the New Testament text outside of our little Facebook groups, that we make private so that people can't see what we're saying. Yeah, there we go. One assumes early corruption, the other presupposes providential preservation. Slightly imperfect Bibles seem to portray a slightly imperfect confidence in the promise of Christ. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Jesus' words in Matthew 24:35 have nothing to do with the Textus Receptus. That is a perversion of Scripture. Okay? So, Christian McShaffrey is a minister of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, pastor of Five Solas Church. That's Five Solas Church. I would say your enshrinement of tradition is a fundamental denial of sola scriptura. So I'm not sure what that fifth sola is. I just challenge you on that. As your brother, I challenge you on that. You're being inconsistent. You're being inconsistent. So there you go.